Please, don't let her speak in front of the children, the mayor whispered, barely hiding his disdain. He called her an outdated symbol, someone who didn't fit the new image of their town. But later that morning, silence answered him louder than any speech. Over 400 veterans stood shoulder to shoulder on the city hall steps. No chants, no signs. Just the gleam of metals, the weight of sacrifice, and the kind of silence that demands respect. One by one they arrived, and the town would never forget why. The bus pulled into the Maple Hill station just after sunrise, its brakes hissing against the stillness of the morning. Rebecca James stepped off 1 foot at a time, the weight of her duffel bag pulling slightly on her shoulder. The town smelled like early summer, fresh-cut grass, distant diesel, and the faint sweetness of blooming lilacs. But what struck her most was the quiet. It had been over a decade since she last walked these streets. Maple Hill, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, had once been a proud little town with American flags on every porch and Memorial Day parades that blocked Main Street from dawn to dusk. But now things felt different. The banners were fewer, faded. Some stores she remembered were gone, replaced with coffee shops boasting sleek logos and chalkboard menus. Others had simply closed their windows, dusty and dark. Rebecca adjusted her blazer, one sleeve carefully tailored, to cover the prosthetic that extended just below her elbow. Her uniform stayed packed. She hadn't worn it since her last military funeral. These days she preferred simplicity, fewer eyes, fewer assumptions. The invitation had come unexpectedly, an email from the Maple Hill Town Council asking her to speak at this year's Memorial Day ceremony. She almost deleted it. Public speaking wasn't something she sought out, especially not about war, but something about the message tugged at her. Maybe it was the name at the bottom of the letter, Mayor Dalton, a man she'd never met. Or maybe it was the memory of her grandfather's voice. She turned off Main Street and walked toward the small cemetery that lay just past the Baptist church. The old path hadn't changed. The names etched in the stones were familiar. She found him near the big oak tree, James Pop Harlan Sargent, U.S. Army, Vietnam. He'd raised her after her parents died, cooked her breakfast before school, taught her how to shoot a rifle and how to hold her head high. "Hey, Pop," she whispered, kneeling down. "I'm home. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm here." A breeze passed through the oak leaves. Rebecca stayed for a long moment. This wasn't the homecoming she imagined, but maybe, just maybe, it was the one she needed. The hum of cicadas in Maple Hill was nothing like the sounds that haunted Rebecca's dreams. Sometimes late at night she still heard it, the crack of gunfire, the thud of a distant explosion, the radio static that always seemed to come right before something went wrong. It had been 8 years since the ambush in Kandahar province. She didn't remember the pain, just the adrenaline, the sand, the blood. Her unit had been stationed near a girls' school, a place frequently threatened by militants who saw education as a danger. Rebecca remembered the girls' faces more than anything, tiny hands clutching notebooks, eyes too old for their age. They'd come under fire during morning drills. The fight lasted hours. 3 of her closest friends didn't survive. She did, barely. She wore a prosthetic now, but the real wounds were harder to see. Survivor's guilt sat heavy in her chest, heavier than the body armor she'd once worn. She often wondered why not Michael or Sarah or Damon? Each had a family waiting for them. She had silence. The military had honored her with medal ceremonies, a folded flag for each lost teammate. And then it had sent her home. Back in Colorado, she found purpose again, not in uniform, but in service. She volunteered with veteran outreach programs, helped others navigate the VA organized local food drives for those too proud to ask for help. She found peace not through speeches or headlines, but in listening, in showing up. But the word hero made her uncomfortable. People used it casually, like a compliment at the grocery store. "Thank you for your service, hero." She'd nod politely, but inside it twisted her stomach. Heroism, she believed, wasn't about medals. It was about sacrifice. And the ones who made the greatest sacrifices didn't come home. Sometimes she'd speak at small events reluctantly when asked by local groups. She never mentioned gunfights or missions. Only people. Human beings who loved and lost and stood for something. Now, with the town of Maple Hill calling her back, expecting her to stand on a stage and speak, Rebecca felt that weight again. Not of trauma, but of expectation. And in her experience, those were two sides of the same coin. Rebecca wandered down Main Street past the faded bookstore that used to host Friday readings and the diner where her grandfather once took her for pie after Sunday services. Some faces she passed lit up with recognition, a wave here, a nod there. Others stared too long, unsure if the woman with the uneven gait and the quiet intensity in her eyes was the same girl they once knew. At Maple Hill Cafe, the bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped in. The place still smelled like cinnamon and burnt coffee, and for a moment she was 16 again, hunched over textbooks at the corner booth. Rebecca James came a familiar voice. She turned to find Martha Ellison, her former high school history teacher, standing behind the counter with two cups in hand. Her silver hair was pulled back into a bun, and her smile was as warm as ever. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here." "I wasn't sure I'd come back," Rebecca admitted. They sat at a small table near the window, sunlight casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. Martha didn't waste time. "I heard you're speaking on Memorial Day." Rebecca nodded. "Apparently that's the plan." Martha's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping. "Just know not everyone's thrilled." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "That's so Mayor Dalton," Martha said, nearly spitting the name. "He's new, young, got himself elected, talking about unity, forward-thinking, community pride. Not a bad thing until he starts preaching that traditional patriotism is dangerous." Rebecca sipped her coffee. "Dangerous. He thinks talking about war glorifies violence, says we should teach our kids about peaceful service, volunteering, environmental work, city planning. He calls it non-combative civic duty. And that's not a bad concept," Rebecca said carefully. "No, it's not," Martha agreed. "But he uses it to downplay military sacrifice. Says things like, 'We need to stop romanticizing conflict.' He plans to speak before you at the ceremony." Rebecca looked out the window at the square where folding chairs were being set up. "Let him talk." "Just be ready," Martha said, leaning in. "He doesn't think there's room for uniforms and medals in his version of this town." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Then maybe he needs a reminder of what those uniforms and medals really stand for." By mid-morning, Maple Hill's town square had transformed into a sea of white chairs, patriotic bunting, and small American flags fluttering from lampposts. The local high school band tuned their instruments beneath a canopy, and town volunteers handed out programs printed with red and blue ink. The stage at the front was modest, just a podium, a few folding chairs, and the statue of a warrior kitty soldier standing sentinel behind it. Rebecca arrived quietly, wearing her dress uniform. The crisp navy blue jacket fit like it always had, though the left sleeve hung empty, gently folded at the elbow. She didn't wear her Medal of Honor. It wasn't about her. Today was for the fallen. Heads turned as she walked through the crowd. Some faces broke into respectful nods. Others watched with polite curiosity, unsure of what to make of her return. She gave no speeches, made no grand gestures, just moved toward her reserved seat near the front with silent poise. Mayor Dalton, already at the podium, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, he looked more like a campaign poster than a public servant. He leaned in briefly. "We'll begin shortly. I'll say a few words before you speak." Rebecca nodded once. "Of course." The national anthem played, followed by the presentation of colors. When Mayor Dalton stepped up to the microphone, his voice rang clear and confident. "Welcome, friends and neighbors. Today we gather not only to remember, but to reimagine what service means in today's world." His speech was eloquent, polished. He spoke of volunteering, of community gardens, youth mentorships, environmental causes, all worthy efforts. But as his tone shifted, so did the energy in the crowd. "We must move beyond outdated ideas of heroism tied to conflict," he continued. "While we respect our veterans, we must be cautious about glorifying violence in front of our children." Then he paused, his eyes landing on Rebecca. "Please, don't let her speak in front of the children." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs rose like wind through dry leaves. Rebecca remained still, her jaw set, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch. In the third row, several older men straightened in their chairs. A Marine in full dress uniform removed his cap. The silence that followed was heavier than any protest. It was the kind of silence that carried a warning, the kind that demanded respect. Rebecca rose slowly from her seat. She didn't glance at Mayor Dalton. She didn't need to. His words had already landed sharp, intentional, and unforgettable. But the crowd had gone still, eyes now fixed on her as she moved toward the podium with the steady grace of someone who had walked through fire and learned to keep walking. She adjusted the mic, letting a breath pass before she spoke. "Good morning." Her voice was calm, even without ceremony or theatrics. "I've heard it said that people like me are outdated, that honoring military service sends the wrong message to the next generation." She let the words linger in the air, not out of bitterness, but clarity. "I'm not here to glorify war. No one who's seen it up close ever would. I'm here because I lost friends I loved like family, and they deserve to be remembered." She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Parents held their children closer. Veterans sat upright, their expressions hard and still. 8 years ago, I was deployed to a small province outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. My unit was tasked with protecting a girls' school, one of the only ones in the region. Those girls walked hours each day just to learn. The Taliban had promised to destroy it. We were there to keep that promise from being fulfilled. Rebecca's hands rested lightly on the podium, her voice steady, but touched with emotion. "The attack came just after dawn. We fought for hours. 3 of my closest teammates never came home." She closed her eyes briefly. "Captain Michael Rodriguez. He had twin daughters. They're almost teenagers now. Lieutenant Sarah Khan. She was a combat medic who saved lives without hesitation. Sergeant Damon Wallace, he carried a wounded child out of the line of fire and went back for more. That's when he was killed." She opened her eyes again, unwavering. "They didn't die for glory, or politics, or medals. They died because they believed that service means sacrifice and some things are worth defending, even at great cost." Rebecca straightened, drawing herself taller. "The girls at that school, they're still learning, still walking those dusty roads. Some are training to be doctors, teachers, engineers. That's not a story about war. That's a story about possibility." She looked out across the square, her voice quiet but firm. "Memorial Day isn't about celebrating conflict. It's about remembering the people we lost and asking ourselves why we remember them." Rebecca stepped back, and for a long moment no one moved. Then one veteran stood, then another, and another, until the square was on its feet, united in silence, in grief, and in something else too, reverence. The applause started softly, just a few claps from the back rows, unsure and hesitant. But it grew. A ripple became a wave, and soon the entire square was on its feet. Veterans stood ramrod straight, hands over hearts. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Some wiped tears, others saluted. Rebecca didn't smile. She simply nodded, then stepped away from the podium with the quiet humility that had defined her every step. She returned to her seat. Mayor Dalton stood stiffly beside the stage, his face unreadable, jaw tight. When he returned to the microphone, the cheers died down. "Thank you, Captain James, for that perspective," he said flatly, attempting to maintain composure. "Though I still believe it is time we move toward more modern, peaceful values in our civic traditions." He was met with murmurs this time, not applause. A woman in the third row stood, gray-haired, proud. "My son died in Iraq," she said clearly. "Don't you dare call that outdated." The silence that followed was thicker than the one before. The ceremony ended not with celebration, but with restrained emotion. The wreath laying proceeded quietly. The band played without fanfare. People dispersed in clusters, some exchanging hushed words, others shaking Rebecca's hand with quiet gratitude. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. That night, someone uploaded a short clip from the event, a shaky cell phone video capturing Mayor Dalton's now infamous line, "Please don't let her speak in front of the children," followed by the unwavering strength of Rebecca's speech. The video spread like wildfire. By midnight, it had been shared across veteran forums, local news channels, and national Facebook groups. Hashtags trended: "Honor is not outdated, let her speak, Memorial Day matters." Veterans from neighboring counties began messaging each other. Plans took shape in comments and private messages. Posts began circulating. "We stand with Rebecca James. If you can be in Maple Hill by morning, bring your uniform. Bring your medals. Bring your silence." It wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about Mayor Dalton anymore. It was about respect, about drawing a line silently where so many lines had already been crossed. Rebecca, back in her hotel room, knew none of this. She had turned off her phone, packed her bag, and planned to catch the early bus home. To her, the battle was over, but for hundreds of others, it was just beginning. The sun rose over Maple Hill with a quiet determination that mirrored what was already unfolding outside City Hall. By 8 a.m., the town's sleepy sidewalks were no longer quiet. Veterans, dozens at first, then hundreds, began arriving in waves. Some came in dress blues, their jackets pressed, their medals polished until they gleamed in the morning light. Others wore faded service jackets, VFW caps, old combat boots, or jeans beneath their uniforms. A few sat in wheelchairs, others leaned on canes, but all stood with the unmistakable bearing of those who had once sworn to serve. They didn't chant, they didn't shout, they didn't hold signs. They simply stood. By 10 a.m., both sides of the wide steps leading into City Hall were lined more than 400 veterans in solemn formation, backs straight, eyes forward. It wasn't a protest, it was a statement, one that couldn't be shouted, only felt. Civilians gathered along the sidewalks, watching in hushed awe. Some brought folding chairs and water bottles for the older men and women in the front rows. Local reporters scrambled to set up cameras, unsure of what they were witnessing, but knowing it mattered. Mayor Dalton arrived late, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the wall of veterans stretching across the front of the building. The color drained from his face. Slowly, almost mechanically, he climbed the steps. At the top stood Rebecca James, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, a simple gray blouse and slacks. Her sleeves still hung empty. She didn't need decorations today. She was flanked by three other veterans, men, much older than her, each with decades of service etched into their skin. One of them, a Marine with silver hair and ribbons that reached from shoulder to belt, rolled forward in a wheelchair. He extended an envelope to the mayor with a quiet firmness. Dalton hesitated, then took it. Inside was a single photograph. Rebecca watched his expression shift as he studied it. The photo showed her in Afghanistan, kneeling beside a handmade wooden cross in a dusty field. Next to her were 5 Afghan girls in school uniforms, gently placing wildflowers at the base. On the back, written in careful black ink, Lieutenant Sarah Khan's Memorial, Kandahar. The girls still visit every year. The mayor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. Rebecca stepped forward. Her voice was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. Now you know what honor looks like. There was no applause, no speeches, just the rustle of flags in the breeze and the quiet breathing of men and women who had seen too much to tolerate disrespect dressed as progress. For 2 hours they stood. At exactly noon, with no visible signal, the veterans raised their hands in a final unified salute. Then just as quietly they turned and walked away. The streets remained still. The silence they left behind thundered louder than any words could have. Rebecca was nearly finished packing when the knock came. It was late morning, and her small suitcase lay open on the bed in her hotel room, half filled with neatly folded clothes, a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and a pair of boots that had been polished but never worn on this trip. She opened the door to find Mayor Dalton standing in the hallway. He looked nothing like the man who had stood on the Memorial Day stage. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there were deep lines under his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice subdued. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "I was just about to check out." "I know," he said. "That's why I came." He didn't sit. He hovered near the door awkwardly, like a man who had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times and still wasn't sure how to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Not just for what I said on stage, for what I believed." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Go on. I grew up during the tail end of the Iraq War. All I ever saw on the news was destruction and failure. I thought questioning patriotism made me enlightened. I thought moving away from military values made me better, smarter." He looked at her, eyes raw with exhaustion. "But the truth is, I didn't know a damn thing. I spoke out of fear. Fear that honoring people like you would undo everything I thought I was trying to build." Rebecca let the silence stretch. He took a breath. "I want to make it right. There's a veterans center on Elm Street. It's been closed for 3 years, budget cuts, low turnout. I want to reopen it, not as a political move, as a place for real healing, real connection." He stepped forward, hopeful but hesitant. "I want you to help lead it." Rebecca blinked, genuinely surprised. "I don't live here. I wasn't planning to." I know, but maybe you could advise us. Help us build something better. Something that's not about appearances, but about people. She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window where the last of the veterans had left only hours earlier. I'll help, she said at last, but on one condition. Anything. This can't be about saving face or legacy. It has to be about service. And not just military service. Community education, youth mentorship. We serve in many ways. Dalton nodded. Then we'll start there. And for the first time since returning to Maple Hill, Rebecca smiled. Just a little. But it was real. 6 months later, the wind carried the scent of autumn through the streets of Maple Hill. Leaves rustled along the sidewalks and the town square was filled once again. Not for a ceremony, but for a new beginning. The freshly painted sign above the brick building on Elm Street read, Maple Hill Veterans and Service Center. Inside the once abandoned space had been transformed. Sunlight poured through restored windows onto polished floors and clean walls adorned with framed portraits, not of war, but of service. Volunteers arranging food boxes, teens from the local high school, organizing clothing donations, and veterans seated at round tables, mentoring younger adults, filled the hall with the quiet hum of purpose. At the front of the room, a modest stage had been set. Mayor Dalton stood behind the podium this time without a suit jacket or practiced smile. He wore a navy sweater and the expression of someone who had finally learned to listen. This center isn't just a building he began. It's a reminder that service comes in many forms. Military, yes, but also mentorship, education, compassion, and second chances. He glanced toward the first row where Rebecca sat in civilian clothes, hands folded, watching without expectation. She had declined the offer to run the center full-time, but had spent the last few months helping to shape its programs, connecting former service members with job resources, starting a weekly PTSD support group, and building a mentorship network that paired veterans with at-risk youth. Captain James, the mayor, continued, taught me that patriotism isn't a slogan or a speech. It's how we show up for each other, especially when it's hard. Applause rose from the room, not thunderous but steady, earned. Later, as people explored the space, children wandered into the art therapy room, while older veterans laughed quietly over coffee and cards. In the career room, a young man filled out a job application with the help of a Marine who'd once walked the same road. Rebecca stood near the back, speaking with a high school senior interested in joining the Air Force. She didn't give speeches. She just answered questions, offered guidance, and listened. When someone asked her why she came back, she simply said, "Because home is where you're needed." And now finally Maple Hill felt like home again, not because of old memories, but because of new purpose. Not just for her, but for everyone learning that service never ends. It simply changes shape. The house was quiet that evening. The late October wind tapped gently at the window panes, and the soft creak of floorboards echoed as Rebecca moved through the small living room of her grandfather's old house, now hers. It had taken time, but she'd decided not to sell it. Instead, she'd restored it room by room, preserving its warmth, its history, and its heartbeat. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a simple wooden frame, one she'd built herself in a community woodworking class offered at the new center. Inside it, nestled on black velvet, was the Medal of Honor she had kept hidden in a drawer for years. But now beside it stood 3 photos, one of Captain Michael Rodriguez, laughing with his daughters, one of Lieutenant Sarah Khan, tending to an Afghan child's bandaged leg, and one of Sergeant Damon Wallace grinning beneath a dusty helmet. She hadn't placed the medal there for herself. She'd placed it there for them, for remembrance, not glory. In the weeks since the center had opened, something had shifted in Maple Hill. Slowly, quietly, at the library, kids were interviewing veterans for a living history project. The high school had added a service learning course where students volunteered at local nonprofits and mentored elementary students. And during Sunday services, it wasn't just military members being thanked. It was nurses, teachers, caregivers, postal workers. The town had begun to understand what Rebecca had long believed. Service is not defined by uniform or rank. It's defined by sacrifice, by showing up, and by giving when there's nothing left to gain. Mayor Dalton had changed too. He spoke less and listened more. He started bringing his daughter to the center on Saturdays, not for photos, but to help serve lunch to the volunteers. Rebecca stepped back from the mantel, studying the photos. She didn't cry. Not anymore. but there was always a weight, a quiet echo of what could have been. She ran her hand along the edge of the frame, and her thoughts drifted to her grandfather, James Pop Harlan, who had taught her how to fish, how to repair a fence, and most of all, how to hold her ground without raising her voice. He used to say something to her whenever she doubted herself, something simple but sturdy. True service never ends, it just finds new forms. Tonight, standing in that house surrounded by memory and meaning, Rebecca finally understood what he meant. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. In a world that often forgets the quiet strength of dignity, Rebecca's story reminds us of something deeper than medals or speeches. It reminds us that service isn't about standing in the spotlight. It's about standing for others even when no one is watching. Whether you've worn a uniform or raised a family taught in a classroom or simply helped a neighbor, your life has meaning. Your sacrifice counts. And maybe like Rebecca's grandfather once said, true service never ends, it just finds new forms. In today's America, we need that reminder more than ever. As values shift and generations change, there's one thing we all still need: respect. For those who came before us, for those who serve quietly today, and for those still learning what service really means. But here's the question we leave you with. What does service look like in your life today? Is it taking care of your spouse, mentoring a younger coworker, volunteering at your church or Veterans Hall, or simply listening, truly listening to someone who needs to be heard? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. How do you define honor in the modern world? Do you agree with Rebecca or with the mayor? Should patriotism be redefined or reclaimed? Your perspective matters, especially to others watching who may feel unseen. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story. If it moved you, please click like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes in quiet strength. And to our older viewers, thank you. You've lived the kind of stories that make this one real. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never stop standing for what matters.